Happening today, rap mogul Suge Knight is due back in court for a bail hearing while he awaits trial on murder charges.
Breaking news out of L.A. A music industry mogul under arrest after a deadly hit and run. Suge Knight.
September 21st, 2018. A 6'2", 300-pound man walks into a Los Angeles courtroom to face sentencing for voluntary manslaughter. His name, Marion Suge Knight, the former CEO of Death Row Records, once the most powerful label in hip-hop history. The judge sentences him to 28 years in prison. But here's what's wild, gang. This wasn't his first violent conviction. It was just the one that finally stuck. For over 2 decades, Suge Knight built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Death Row Records sold over 150 million records worldwide. They had Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac Shakur, legends who changed hip-hop forever. But behind the platinum plaques and the chart-topping hits was something way more sinister. Artists were getting beaten in the infamous Red Room. Contracts were signed at gunpoint. Millions of dollars disappeared into Suge's pockets while the people who actually made the music got nothing. Dr. Dre walked away from Death Row with just the clothes on his back, leaving behind all his masters. Snoop Dogg had to pay millions just to escape. And Tupac? He signed a 3-page handwritten contract while sitting in prison, desperate for freedom, not knowing he was signing his life away. Today, we're breaking down exactly how Suge Knight finessed his artists out of millions, how he used fear and violence to control everyone around him, and why he's considered the most evil CEO in hip-hop history. We're going to expose the beatings, the extortion, the threats, and the systematic destruction of careers, all backed by court documents, artist testimonies, and proven convictions. Stick around until the end, because what we uncover about Suge Knight's reign of terror will show you why Death Row Records wasn't just a label. It was a criminal enterprise disguised as a business. This is the untold story of hip-hop's most dangerous CEO. Let's get into it. Before we dive into how Suge Knight destroyed the lives of his artists, we need to understand how Death Row Records became the most powerful and feared label in hip-hop. Marion Hugh Knight Jr., better known as Suge Knight, was born on April 19, 1965 in Compton, California. Growing up in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America, Suge witnessed his first murder at just 5 or 6 years old. The streets of Compton were unforgiving, and they shaped Suge into the ruthless figure he would become. But Suge's path wasn't supposed to lead to the music industry. He was a football star, playing defensive tackle at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, from 1985 to 1986. His coaches described him as well-mannered, a yes sir, no sir type of player. But that image was just a mask, fam. By 1987, Suge's football career was over. He played 2 replacement games for the LA Rams during the NFL players' strike, but that was it. And almost immediately after his football dreams died, the real Suge Knight emerged. In October 1987, just weeks after his football career ended, Suge was arrested for domestic assault after he grabbed his girlfriend by the hair and cut off her ponytail with scissors. 2 weeks later, he shot his friend Ricky Crockett in the leg and wrist during an argument, then stole his car. He was arrested and charged, but somehow got it reduced to a misdemeanor with just a $1,000 fine and probation. This was the beginning of a pattern that would define Suge Knight's entire career. Violence, intimidation, and somehow always escaping serious consequences, at least for a while. By the late 1980s, Suge was working as a bodyguard for celebrities, including Bobby Brown. But he wasn't just protecting people, he was learning the music business from the inside. He saw how much money was being made, and more importantly, he saw how artists were being exploited by their labels and managers. Suge started his own artist management company and began representing West Coast rappers like the D.O.C., DJ Quick, and Mario Chocolate Johnson. And this is where we see the first major example of Suge's intimidation tactics. In 1990, Vanilla Ice released Ice Ice Baby, which became a massive hit. But according to Suge, Mario Johnson had co-written the song and wasn't getting paid. So Suge decided to handle it his way. Vanilla Ice himself has told this story multiple times. Suge showed up at his hotel room in Los Angeles with 6 other men, all armed. They roughed up his bodyguards, then Suge took Vanilla Ice out onto the balcony, 15 floors up. He had me look over the edge, show me how high I was up there. Vanilla Ice recalled in an interview, "I needed to wear a diaper on that day. I was very scared." Suge allegedly told Vanilla Ice to sign over points from Ice Ice Baby to Mario Johnson, or else. Vanilla Ice signed away royalties worth an estimated $3 to $4 million that night. Now, Suge has denied threatening to throw Vanilla Ice off the balcony, but he's never denied showing up with armed men and intimidating him into signing. And that money, it helped fund what would become Death Row Records. In 1991, Suge Knight partnered with Dr. Dre, the DOC, and Dick Griffey to form Death Row Records. But the label needed serious funding, and that's where things get even shadier. The money came from Michael Harry O. Harris, a drug kingpin who was serving a life sentence in prison. Harry O. invested $1.5 million into Death Row through his lawyer, David Kenner, who would later become Death Row's attorney. This created a massive conflict of interest that would screw over multiple artists down the line. But before Death Row could sign anyone, they needed to get Dr. Dre out of his contract with Ruthless Records, owned by Eazy-E and Jerry Heller. And this is where Suge's reputation for violence really took off. According to multiple sources, Suge showed up at Eazy-E's office with armed men and threatened him until he released Dr. Dre from his contract. Jerry Heller later claimed that Suge and his crew were carrying baseball bats and pipes, and that Eazy-E was genuinely terrified. Eazy-E eventually signed a release, but it was allegedly a fake signature. He still managed to negotiate a deal where he'd get 20% of everything Dr. Dre produced for the next 6 years. But the message was clear. Suge Knight was willing to use violence to get what he wanted. By 1992, Death Row Records was officially up and running. Dr. Dre released The Chronic, which became one of the greatest hip-hop albums of all time, selling over 5.7 million copies. The next year, Snoop Dogg released Doggy Style, which debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200 and sold 800,000 copies in its first week. Death Row was on top of the world, fam. But behind the scenes, the artists who made all that success possible were about to learn what it really meant to be signed to Suge Knight. Now let's talk about how Suge Knight controlled his artists once they were signed to Death Row. Because this wasn't just about bad contracts or unfair splits. This was about creating an environment of fear so intense that people were too scared to leave, too scared to ask questions, and too scared to demand what they were owed. Multiple former Death Row artists and employees have talked about the Red Room at the Death Row offices. This was Suge's personal office, and it was where beatings took place. The room was decorated with stuffed animals from Suge's hunting trips and an arsenal of weapons displayed on the wall behind his desk. AK-47s, handguns, rifles, all visible to anyone who walked in. The message was clear: you're in Suge's world now, and he has the power to do whatever he wants. Daryl Harper, a former Death Row producer, recalled watching Tupac beat the hell out of producer Sam Snead in that room. Sam had invited only New York-based rappers to be in one of his music videos, which pissed off Tupac during the height of the East Coast versus West Coast beef. Pac standing with his hands to the side, he started letting loose on him, Harper said. He went down, he got up, and Pac let loose again. Sam was trying to get up under this ornament in Suge's office, trying to get out the way, man. It was a lot of thunder happening. And Suge, he just watched. He let it happen, because that's how he maintained control, by allowing and even encouraging violence against anyone who stepped out of line. Yuckmouth, another former Rap-A-Lot affiliate who witnessed the Death Row operation, said it plainly. Artists was getting fed up, physically. If you go against the grain, man, it's gonna be some S. One of the most documented examples of Suge's violence happened in 1992, and it's the incident that would eventually lead to his first serious legal trouble. George and Linwood Stanley, two rappers, came to the Death Row offices to meet with Dr. Dre. While they were there, Linwood picked up a phone to make a call, but that phone was the Harry O line, the phone Suge used exclusively to communicate with Michael Harris in prison. Suge walked in and told Linwood to get off the phone. Linwood refused and told Suge not to talk to him like that. Big mistake, fam. Suge left the room, then came back with a gun. He pointed it at both brothers' heads and ordered them to get on their knees and strip down to their underwear. When they hesitated, he fired a shot near one of their ears, then pistol whipped Linwood Stanley. After beating them, Suge took their wallets, pulled out their IDs, and told them that if they went to the police, he would find their families and kill them. But the Stanley brothers did go to the police, and this became one of the first cases where Suge Knight's violence was officially documented. However, in a move that shows just how corrupt the system around Suge was, the case got complicated when it was revealed that Suge had given the prosecuting attorney's daughter a record deal. The attorney, Larry Longo, was eventually fired, but the damage was done. This incident set the tone for how Death Row would operate. Violence was the enforcement mechanism, and Suge had enough power and connections to make problems go away, at least temporarily. It wasn't just the physical violence that controlled people. It was the constant threat of violence. The knowledge that if you said the wrong thing, looked at Suge the wrong way, or tried to leave, something bad would happen. Nate Dogg, one of Death Row's artists, admitted that he carried a gun and wore a bulletproof vest every time he went to the Death Row offices. He didn't trust anyone there, and he was genuinely afraid for his life. Every time I went into that building, I felt scared, Nate said. I didn't know what was going to happen. Think about that, gang. An artist signed to a record label was so afraid of his own CEO that he had to arm himself just to go to work. That's not a business. That's a hostage situation. Dr. Dre, who was supposed to be Suge's partner and co-founder of Death Row, eventually got fed up with the violence and the chaos. In 1996, after spending 8 months in jail for a probation violation, Dre decided he was done. The vibe for me was like a divorce, and I was a child left behind, Snoop Dogg said about Dre's departure. I wanted to go with you. Why can't I go with you? I don't want to stay here. But Dre couldn't take anyone with him, and he couldn't take his masters, his music, or any of the money he was owed. Suge made sure of that. One of Suge's tactics was giving artists gifts, cars, jewelry, cash, but keeping everything in his own name. This created a false sense of loyalty and gratitude while actually maintaining complete control. RBX, a Death Row artist, was offered a BMW by Suge, but Dr. Dre warned him, "What do you have in that BMW that says you have permission to drive it and it's yours? Nothing. If you don't take that car back to homeboy right now, you're making a mistake." Snoop Dogg later confirmed that all of his cars were registered in Suge Knight's name. "All my cars was in Suge Knight's name," Snoop said. "I'd get pulled over and the police would be like, 'Oh yeah, Mr. Knight.' I'm like, 'I'm not Mr. Knight.' That's how I found out." So even when artists thought they were being rewarded, they were actually being controlled. Suge could take those cars back at any time. He could report them stolen. He could use them as leverage. It was all part of the system, fam. A system designed to keep artists dependent, scared, and unable to leave. Let's talk about Dr. Dre, because his story is the perfect example of how Suge Knight finessed even his closest partners out of millions. Dr. Dre was the heart and soul of Death Row Records. He produced The Chronic, Doggy Style, and countless other hits. He discovered Snoop Dogg. He was the creative genius behind the label's entire sound. But by 1996, Dre was done. The violence, the chaos, the constant fear, it was too much. And there was another issue. Michelle, Dre's longtime on and off girlfriend, had started dating Suge Knight. "What was Michelle's role during this whole time while you were at Death Row?" someone asked the DOC in an interview. "Super big-oo," he replied. "Super." Whether the Michelle situation was the main reason or just the final straw, Dre decided to leave. But leaving Death Row wasn't like quitting a normal job. Suge made sure of that. When Dre told Suge he wanted to leave, Suge allegedly told him, "When you want to leave, you can go with Jimmy Iovine, but you just leave with the shirt on your back." And that's exactly what happened, fam. Dr. Dre walked away from Death Row Records with nothing. No masters, no royalties from his past work, no ownership stake in the label he co-founded. Think about what that means. The Chronic has sold over 5.7 million copies in the US alone. It's been streamed billions of times. It's considered one of the greatest hip-hop albums ever made, and Dr. Dre doesn't own it. Suge Knight does. Every time Nothing But a G Thang plays on the radio, Suge gets paid. Every time someone streams Let Me Ride, Suge gets paid. Dre gets nothing from those songs. The same goes for all the production work Dre did on Doggy Style, on Tupac's albums, on every other Death Row release. Suge structured the contracts so that the label owned everything. And when Dre left, he left empty-handed. People have asked why Dr. Dre, one of the most successful producers in history, would just walk away without fighting for what he was owed. The answer is simple: he was scared. Dre had seen what Suge was capable of. He'd seen the beatings, the threats, the violence. He knew that if he tried to fight Suge in court or demand his masters, things could get ugly, and not just in a legal sense. So Dre made a calculation. His life and his freedom were worth more than the money. He could always make new music, build a new label, create new hits. But he couldn't do any of that if he was dead or in the hospital. And that's exactly what he did. Dre started Aftermath Entertainment with Jimmy Iovine in 1996. He discovered Eminem and 50 Cent. He built a new empire, and eventually he sold Beats by Dre to Apple for $3 billion, making him one of the wealthiest figures in hip-hop history. But the fact remains, Suge Knight finessed Dr. Dre, the co-founder of Death Row Records, out of millions of dollars in royalties and ownership, and he did it through fear and intimidation. After Dre left and started having massive success with Aftermath, Suge couldn't handle it. He started doing interviews where he downplayed Dre's contributions to Death Row. Dre was never that important, Suge said in one interview. Tupac was the real star. Dre was jealous of Tupac. He even claimed that Snoop and Dre hated each other because they were both jealous of Tupac's success. Snoop and Dre at the end hated each other, Suge said. You could tell that by the simple fact that when Snoop did Dogfather, Pac was not on one song. But this was all revisionist history, fam. Suge was trying to rewrite the narrative to make himself look like the genius behind Death Row's success, when in reality, he was just the muscle. Dre was the talent. And the fact that Dre walked away and still became a billionaire while Suge ended up in prison for 28 years tells you everything you need to know about who really mattered. If Dr. Dre's story shows how Suge treated his partners, Snoop Dogg's story shows how he treated his biggest stars. Snoop Dogg was discovered by Dr. Dre and became the breakout star of Death Row Records. Doggy Style sold 800,000 copies in its first week and went on to sell over 11 million copies worldwide. Snoop was everywhere: MTV, radio, magazine covers. He was the face of West Coast hip-hop, but behind the scenes, Snoop was trapped, and it would take years and millions of dollars for him to escape. In 1993, before Doggy Style even dropped, Snoop was involved in a shooting that would hang over his head for years. His bodyguard, McKinley Malik Lee, shot and killed Philip Woldemariam, an alleged rival gang member, during a confrontation. Snoop wanted to turn himself in immediately, but Suge had other plans. Snoop had the MTV Video Music Awards coming up in a week, and Suge needed him to promote the album. So Suge told Snoop to lay low, perform at the awards, and then turn himself in. Snoop did exactly that. He performed at the VMAs, then was arrested immediately afterward. Suge posted a $1 million bail to get him out. Now, on the surface, this looks like Suge was helping Snoop. But let's be real, gang. Suge wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He was protecting his investment. Snoop was about to make Death Row millions of dollars, and Suge couldn't let him sit in jail. The murder case dragged on for years. Snoop and Malik were eventually acquitted in 1996, but the legal fees were astronomical. Suge allegedly spent close to $10 million on Snoop's defense. But here's the thing, that money wasn't a gift, it was a debt, and Suge made sure Snoop knew it. Snoop has talked openly about how he didn't see real money from Death Row for years. Despite Doggy Style selling millions of copies, despite sold-out tours and constant radio play, Snoop was broke. "I didn't have no money," Snoop said in an interview. "I was the biggest rapper in the world and I was broke." How is that possible? Because Suge controlled everything. The contracts were structured so that the label recouped all expenses before the artist saw a dime. And those expenses included everything: studio time, music videos, promotion, legal fees, and even the cars and jewelry that Suge gifted to Snoop. So even though Snoop was generating millions in revenue, he was technically in debt to the label, and Suge used that debt as leverage to keep him locked in. By 1997, Snoop knew he had to get out. Dr. Dre was gone. Tupac was dead. The East Coast versus West Coast beef had spiraled out of control, and Suge was about to go to prison for violating his probation. Snoop started making moves to leave Death Row, but it wasn't easy. Suge wasn't going to just let his biggest remaining star walk away. That's when Master P stepped in. Master P, who was running No Limit Records at the time, reached out to Suge and negotiated a deal. According to reports, Master P paid Suge several $1 million to release Snoop from his contract. "I was working against the devil, and through the grace of God, Master P put a deal together which was suitable for Mr. Knight," Snoop said. But even after paying millions to get out, Snoop still didn't own his Death Row masters, Doggy Style, all his guest appearances, all his contributions to Death Row compilations. Suge still owned all of it. To this day, Snoop Dogg doesn't make money from his Death Row catalog. Every time Gin and Juice plays, Suge's estate gets paid, not Snoop. It wasn't just about the money, though. The emotional and psychological toll of being at Death Row was immense. "Whenever I speak on Death Row, it brings back bad vibes, and I don't really like dwelling on it," Snoop said years later. Think about that, fam. Snoop Dogg, one of the most laid-back, positive figures in hip-hop, still gets bad vibes when he thinks about Death Row. That's how toxic the environment was. Snoop has also talked about how he was afraid during his time at Death Row. He didn't trust anyone. He didn't feel safe. And he knew that if he tried to leave without Suge's permission, there would be consequences. They was not scared of Suge Knight. They was terrified of Suge Knight, one industry insider said, and Snoop was no exception. Even as the biggest star on the label, he was still under Suge's control, still afraid, still trapped. Now we come to the most tragic story of all, Tupac Shakur. Because what Suge Knight did to Tupac wasn't just financial exploitation, it was taking advantage of a desperate man at his lowest point and turning him into a weapon for Suge's own agenda. In 1995, Tupac was serving time at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York for sexual assault charges. He'd already been in prison for 9 months, and he was broke. His legal fees had drained him. Interscope Records, his label, had stopped supporting him financially because their parent company, Time Warner, wanted to distance themselves from the controversy. Tupac was desperate, and Suge Knight saw an opportunity. Suge had been interested in signing Tupac for years, but Tupac had always turned him down. He knew Suge's reputation. He knew about the violence and the intimidation. But now, sitting in a prison cell with no money and no support, Tupac didn't have a choice. Suge visited Tupac in prison and made him an offer. I'll post your $1.4 million bail and get you out of here. In exchange, you sign with Death Row for your next 3 albums. But here's where it gets shady, gang. The contract Tupac signed wasn't even a real contract. It was a 3-page handwritten memo drafted by David Kenner, Suge's attorney. And remember, David Kenner was Suge's lawyer and Death Row's lawyer. So who was representing Tupac's interests? Nobody. It was a massive conflict of interest, and it was completely unethical, possibly even illegal. The memo stated that Tupac would get a $1 million advance plus expenses in exchange for 3 albums. It also stated that David Kenner would represent Tupac and that Suge would manage him. But here's the thing, Tupac was still signed to Interscope, so technically, this deal with Death Row shouldn't have even been possible without Interscope releasing him first. But Suge and Kenner didn't care about technicalities. They just wanted Tupac locked in. People often say that Suge Knight bailed Tupac out of prison, but that's not entirely accurate. Suge didn't pay $1.4 million out of his own pocket. The bail had 3 components: $850,000 posted as a corporate guarantee by Atlantic Records, $250,000 posted by Interscope Records, $300,000 posted as a bail bond to be paid back by Tupac through future royalties. So Suge didn't actually pay the bail himself, he just facilitated it and took credit for it. And in return, he got Tupac to sign away his next 3 albums. But to Tupac, it didn't matter who paid what. All he knew was that Suge got him out of prison when nobody else would. And that created a sense of loyalty and debt that Suge would exploit for the rest of Tupac's life. When Tupac got out of prison, he was a different person. He was angrier, more paranoid, more willing to embrace the thug life persona that Suge encouraged. Before Death Row, Tupac's music had depth. He talked about social issues, about his mother's struggles, about the complexities of life in the hood. But after signing with Death Row, his music became more aggressive, more focused on the East Coast versus West Coast beef, more about violence and revenge. When Suge signed Tupac into the label, many said that Knight became uncontrollable, one documentary stated. Under Suge's influence, Tupac was following his outlook on life. Suge saw Tupac as a weapon. He knew Tupac was angry at Biggie and the Bad Boy camp because of the 1994 shooting at Quad Studios. So Suge encouraged that anger. He fueled the beef. He pushed Tupac to go harder, to be more aggressive, to make the conflict personal. And Tupac, feeling like he owed Suge for getting him out of prison, went along with it. In February 1996, Tupac released All Eyes on Me, a double album that would become one of the best-selling hip-hop albums of all time. It sold over 566,000 copies in its first week and has since been certified diamond, 10 million copies sold in the US alone. The album was executive produced by Suge Knight, and it made Death Row millions of dollars. But how much did Tupac actually see from that success? According to reports, Tupac was paid his $1 million advance, but after that, he was subject to the same contract structure as every other Death Row artist. The label recouped all expenses first, and only then would the artist start seeing royalties. And remember, Tupac's expenses included his bail money, his legal fees, his studio time, his music videos, and all the other costs associated with promoting the album. So even though All Eyes on Me was a massive commercial success, Tupac likely didn't see much money from it. In fact, when Tupac died in September 1996, he was reportedly in debt. His mother, Finessed Shakur, had to fight for years to get control of his estate and his masters. And even then, much of Tupac's Death Row catalog remained under Suge's control for years. But the financial exploitation wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that Suge used Tupac's talent, his fame, and his anger to fuel a beef that would ultimately get Tupac killed. On September 7, 1996, Tupac and Suge attended a Mike Tyson fight in Las Vegas. After the fight, they got into a confrontation with Orlando Anderson, a Crips gang member in the MGM Grand Casino. Tupac and Suge's crew jumped Orlando and beat him up. A few hours later, while Tupac and Suge were driving to a nightclub, a white Cadillac pulled up next to them and someone opened fire. Tupac was hit 4 times. Suge was grazed by a bullet in his head, but survived. Tupac died 6 days later on September 13, 1996. He was 25 years old. And where was Suge during all of this? He was in the driver's seat. He was right there when Tupac got shot. And according to some conspiracy theories, Suge may have even been involved in setting up the hit, though there's no concrete evidence to support that claim. What we do know is this: Suge encouraged the beef with Bad Boy. Suge encouraged the confrontation with Orlando Anderson. Suge put Tupac in dangerous situations over and over again. And when Tupac died, Suge lost his biggest star, but he still owned all of Tupac's death row masters. To this day, Suge Knight's estate continues to make money off of Tupac's music. All Eyes on Me, California Love, How Do You Want It, every stream, every sale, Suge's estate gets a cut. Tupac's family has fought for years to get control of his music, and they've had some success. But the fact remains, Suge Knight exploited Tupac when he was at his most vulnerable, used him to make millions, and then profited off his death. That's not just a bad business deal, gang. That's evil. Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, and Tupac are the most famous examples of Suge Knight's exploitation, but they weren't the only ones. There were dozens of other artists, producers, and employees who got finessed, beaten, or threatened during Death Row's reign. The DOC was one of the most talented rappers and writers in the late 80s and early 90s. He wrote for NWA, he had a successful solo album, and he was instrumental in the creation of Death Row Records. But in 1989, the DOC was in a near-fatal car accident that crushed his larynx and permanently damaged his voice. He could no longer rap the way he used to, so he transitioned into writing and producing. The DOC was there from the beginning of Death Row. He helped Suge and Dre put the label together. He wrote for Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg. He was a key part of the creative team. But when it came time to split the profits, the DOC got screwed. According to him, his name was gradually removed from the paperwork. He was supposed to be a partner, but Suge turned him into just another employee. Suge went from friend to bully, the DOC said in an interview. My name and involvement started to morph out of the paperwork. The DOC eventually left Death Row with nothing. No ownership stake, no royalties, no credit for all the work he'd done. Suge had finessed him out of millions. Michelle was a singer signed to Death Row Records and was also in a relationship with Dr. Dre for years before dating Suge Knight. When asked about her role at Death Row, the DOC didn't hold back. Super B. Super. Michelle herself has spoken about the abuse she suffered at Death Row. She's claimed that Suge once punched her so hard that her jaw dislocated. She's talked about the toxic environment and the fear that permeated every aspect of the label. And like so many others, Michelle didn't make much money from her time at Death Row. Her music was controlled by the label, and she had little say in her own career. Nate Dogg was one of the most iconic voices in West Coast hip-hop. His hooks on songs like Regulate and Ain't No Fun are legendary, but his time at Death Row was marked by fear and financial exploitation. As mentioned earlier, Nate carried a gun and wore a bulletproof vest every time he went to the Death Row offices. He didn't trust anyone there, and he was genuinely afraid for his safety. Suge also allegedly spent $250,000 to keep Nate out of prison after he was accused of robbing a Taco Bell. But just like with Snoop's legal fees, that money wasn't a gift. It was a debt that Nate would have to repay through his work. The Dog Pound, made up of Kurupt and Daz Dillinger, were two of Death Row's most prolific artists. They released multiple albums and appeared on countless Death Row compilations. But like everyone else, they didn't see much money from their success. The contracts were structured to benefit the label, not the artists. And when they eventually left Death Row, they left without their master. Daz has spoken openly about the financial exploitation at Death Row. He said that artists were making pennies while Suge was making millions. It wasn't just the artists who got finessed. Producers, engineers, and other behind-the-scenes workers were also exploited. Daryl Harper, a producer at Death Row, witnessed multiple beatings and has talked about the atmosphere of fear. He said that if you went against Suge, you'd get physically. There are stories of producers being beaten for rewinding a tape too far, stories of engineers being threatened for making mistakes, stories of people being forced to work long hours without proper compensation because they were too afraid to say no. Suge had created a system where everyone was expendable. If you didn't do what he wanted, he'd find someone else, and you might get hurt in the process. When you look at all these stories together, a clear pattern emerges. Suge would sign artists or bring in talent. He'd create a sense of loyalty through gifts or by helping with legal issues. He'd structure contracts to benefit the label, not the artist. He'd use fear and intimidation to keep people in line. When people tried to leave, he'd make it as difficult and expensive as possible. And even after they left, he'd keep their masters and continue profiting off their work. This wasn't just bad business, gang. This was a systematic exploitation of creative people. Suge Knight built an empire on the backs of talented artists, and when they tried to get what they were owed, he used violence and fear to keep them quiet. Now let's talk about Suge Knight's criminal record, because this is what separates him from other exploitative music executives. Suge didn't just finesse people financially, he physically hurt them. And unlike other industry figures who've been accused of violence, Suge's violence has been proven in court multiple times. Throughout the 1990s, Suge was arrested multiple times for various violent offenses. 1987, domestic assault, cutting his girlfriend's hair and shooting his friend Ricky Crockett. 1992, the Stanley Brothers incident, assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment. 1995, assault on 2 rappers at a recording studio. 1996, probation violation after being caught on video participating in the beating of Orlando Anderson at the MGM Grand, the incident that preceded Tupac's murder. For the Orlando Anderson beating, Suge was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He served 5 years before being released in 2001, but even after getting out, Suge couldn't stay out of trouble. 2002, arrested for violating parole after getting into a fight at a Hollywood nightclub. 2005, shot in the leg at a party hosted by Kanye West at a Miami Beach nightclub. He was the victim in this case, but it shows the violent world he operated in. 2008, arrested for possession and assault after allegedly punching his girlfriend and holding a knife to her throat. 2008, knocked out outside a nightclub after confronting someone about money he claimed he was owed. 2009, knocked out again, this time by a barber after another confrontation. In August 2014, Suge was at a nightclub in Los Angeles when someone opened fire, hitting him 6 times. He survived, but the incident showed that even in his 50s, Suge was still surrounded by violence. Many people speculated that the shooting was retaliation for something Suge had done, though no one was ever charged. On January 29, 2015, Suge Knight was on the set of the movie Straight Outta Compton, a biopic about NWA and the rise of West Coast hip-hop. Suge was not happy about how he was being portrayed in the film, and he'd allegedly been making threatening phone calls to the director F. Gary Gray. Suge showed up at a nearby location where some of the film's crew were working. He got into an argument with Clee Bone Sloan, who was working as a security consultant on the film, and Terry Carter, a music executive and Suge's former friend. The argument escalated and Suge got into his truck. Then, according to witnesses and security footage, Suge put the truck in reverse and hit Bone. But instead of driving away, he put the truck in drive and ran over both Bone and Terry Carter. Bone survived with serious injuries. Terry Carter died at the scene. Suge claimed it was self-defense, that he was being attacked and feared for his life. But the video footage told a different story. It showed Suge hitting the men once, then deliberately running them over again. Suge was arrested and charged with murder, attempted murder, and hit and run. He spent 3 years in jail awaiting trial, during which time he had multiple health issues, including a blood clot and collapsing in court. Finally, on September 20th, 2018, Suge Knight pleaded no contest to voluntary manslaughter. The next day, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. At the sentencing, the judge said, "This defendant has been a serious danger to the community his entire adult life." Terry Carter's family gave victim impact statements talking about the pain of losing their loved one and how Suge had shown no remorse. Suge, for his part, apologized and claimed he never meant to hurt anyone, but it was too little, too late. Suge Knight is the only major music executive in hip-hop history to be convicted of violent crimes multiple times. Other executives have been accused of shady business practices, of exploiting artists, of being involved in violence. But Suge is the only one whose violence has been proven in court over and over again. This isn't speculation, gang. This isn't rumor or conspiracy theory. This is documented fact. Suge Knight used violence to build his empire, to control his artists, and to maintain his power. And eventually, that violence caught up with him. Now let's talk numbers, because when you add up all the money that Suge Knight finessed from his artists, the total is staggering. The Chronic has sold over 5.7 million copies in the US alone. Conservatively, if Dre had owned his masters and received a standard royalty rate of $2 to $3 per album sold, he would have made at least $11 to $17 million just from album sales. Add in streaming revenue, the album has been streamed billions of times, licensing fees for movies and commercials and other revenue streams, and Dre has likely lost out on $30 to $50 million in royalties from The Chronic alone. Then factor in all the production work he did on other Death Row albums, Doggy Style, Tupac's albums, Thought Dog Pound, etc., and the number easily climbs to over $100 million in lost earnings. Doggy Style sold 11 million copies worldwide. Using the same conservative estimate, Snoop should have made at least $22 to $33 million from album sales alone. Add in streaming, touring, merchandise, and other revenue, and Snoop has likely lost out on $50 to $75 million from his Death Row catalog. And remember, Snoop also had to pay Master P several million dollars just to get out of his contract, so not only did he lose his royalties, he had to pay to escape. All Eyes on Me has sold over 10 million copies in the US, Diamond certification. That's at least $20 to $30 million in royalties that should have gone to Tupac or his estate. Add in The Don Illuminati, The 7-Day Theory, released under the name Machiavelli, which sold 4 million copies, and all the posthumous compilations that Death Row released, and Tupac's estate has lost out on at least $50 to $75 million. Afeni Shakur spent years fighting to get control of Tupac's masters, and she eventually succeeded in getting some of them back. But for years, Suge was profiting off Tupac's death while Tupac's family struggled financially. When you add in the DOC, Nate Dogg, Thought Dog Pound, Michelle, and all the other artists who were signed to Death Row, the total amount of money that Suge finessed from his artists is easily over $300 to $400 million. And that's a conservative estimate, gang. The real number could be much higher when you factor in all the hidden costs, the recoupable expenses, the shady accounting practices, and the fact that Suge controlled everything. So where did all that money go? Some of it went to Suge's lavish lifestyle. Mansions, cars, jewelry, private jets. Some of it went to legal fees. Suge spent millions on lawyers over the years. Some of it went to paying off debts and settling lawsuits, but a lot of it just disappeared. Death Row Records filed for bankruptcy in 2006, claiming debts of over $100 million. Artists were owed millions in unpaid royalties. Creditors were owed millions for unpaid bills. Suge had run the label into the ground through mismanagement, violence, and greed. And when it all collapsed, the artists who had made Death Row successful were left with nothing. Now we need to ask the hard question. How did Suge Knight get away with this for so long? Why didn't anyone stop him? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few key factors. First, we have to acknowledge that Suge Knight wasn't the only music executive exploiting artists in the 1990s. The entire music industry was built on unfair contracts, shady accounting, and taking advantage of young, inexperienced artists. Artists routinely signed deals where they gave up their masters, where they were charged for every expense imaginable, where they made pennies on the dollar while the label made millions. Suge just took it to an extreme by adding violence and intimidation to the mix. But the financial exploitation, that was standard practice in the industry. In the 1990s, hip-hop was in its gangster rap era. Artists were competing to see who was the hardest, the most street, the most dangerous, and Suge Knight fit perfectly into that narrative. He was the real-life gangster CEO. He was the guy who actually lived the life that rappers rapped about. And for a while, that made him cool. It made him respected. It made him powerful. Artists wanted to be associated with Death Row because it gave them street cred. Being signed to Suge Knight meant you were really about that life. But what people didn't realize, or chose to ignore, was that the violence wasn't just for show. It was real, and it was being used to control and exploit people. As we've discussed throughout this video, fear was Suge's most powerful weapon. People were too scared to speak out against him, too scared to go to the police, too scared to sue him. And when people did try to stand up to Suge, bad things happened. They got beaten, they got threatened, they got blackballed from the industry. So most people just stayed quiet and hoped they could get out alive. Suge couldn't have done all of this alone. He had enablers, lawyers, accountants, managers who helped him structure these exploitative deals and who looked the other way when violence occurred. David Kenner, Death Row's attorney, is a perfect example. He represented Suge, the label, and individual artists like Tupac. That's a massive conflict of interest, and it allowed Suge to control every aspect of the business. Law enforcement also failed to stop Suge for years. Despite multiple arrests, despite documented violence, despite complaints from victims, Suge kept getting away with it. Part of this was because victims were too scared to testify. Part of it was because Suge had good lawyers who could get charges reduced or dismissed. And part of it was because the system just didn't take violence in the hip-hop industry seriously enough. It wasn't until 2015, when Suge killed Terry Carter in broad daylight on camera, that the system finally held him accountable. By the late 1990s, Death Row Records was falling apart, and the collapse was directly tied to Suge Knight's violence and mismanagement. After Dr. Dre left in 1996, other artists started looking for the exit too. Snoop Dogg left in 1998, Nate Dogg left, Corrupt and Daz left. Even Suge's own brother, who performed as Star Realist, eventually distanced himself from the label. By the time Suge went to prison in 1997 for violating his probation, Death Row had lost almost all of its major talent. The label tried to continue operating with Suge running things from behind bars, but it was never the same. As Death Row collapsed, the lawsuits started piling up. Artists sued for unpaid royalties, producers sued for unpaid fees, creditors sued for unpaid bills. Michael Harry O. Harris, kingpin who had funded Death Row's creation, sued Suge for cutting him out of the profits. Harry O. claimed he was owed millions, and he had the paperwork to prove it. Lydia Harris, Harry O.'s ex-wife, also sued, claiming she was a co-founder of Death Row and had been written out of the company's history. The legal battles dragged on for years, draining whatever money Death Row had left. In 2006, Death Row Records filed for bankruptcy, claiming debts of over $100 million. The label's assets, including its catalog of master recordings, were put up for auction. In 2009, the catalog was sold to Wide Awake Entertainment for $18 million. Later, in 2013, Entertainment One, E1, acquired the catalog. And in 2022, in a twist of poetic justice, Snoop Dogg acquired the Death Row Records brand and catalog. The artist who had been exploited by the label now owned it. I am thrilled and appreciative of the opportunity to acquire the iconic and culturally significant Death Row Records brand, Snoop said in a statement. This is an extremely meaningful moment for me. Snoop now controls his own masters and the masters of other Death Row artists. He's working to re-release the catalog and give artists their proper due. As for Suge Knight, he's currently serving his 28-year sentence at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, California. He's 59 years old, and if he serves his full sentence, he won't be released until 2037, when he'll be 72. Suge has given interviews from prison, and he's tried to rehabilitate his image. He's claimed that he was misunderstood, that he was just trying to protect his artists, that the violence was exaggerated. But the facts speak for themselves, gang. Suge Knight was convicted of multiple violent crimes. He exploited his artists financially. He created an environment of fear that destroyed lives and careers. And now he's paying the price. So what can we learn from the Suge Knight story? What does this tell us about the music industry, about hip-hop culture, and about how we treat artists? Suge Knight thought he could build an empire through fear and intimidation. And for a while, it worked. But in the end, the violence destroyed everything he built. Death Row collapsed, his artists left, his reputation was ruined, and he ended up in prison for the rest of his life. Violence might give you short-term power, but it's not sustainable. Eventually, it catches up with you. The biggest financial mistake that Dr. Dre, Snoop Dogg, Tupac, and other Death Row artists made was not owning their masters. When you don't own your masters, you don't control your music. You don't get the royalties. You don't get to decide how your music is used. Someone else profits off your creativity. This is a lesson that modern artists have taken to heart. More and more artists are demanding ownership of their masters, and they're willing to walk away from major label deals to get it. Taylor Swift famously re-recorded her entire catalog to own her masters. Chance the Rapper built his career as an independent artist. Russ, Macklemore, and others have shown that you can be successful without signing away your rights. The Death Row story is a cautionary tale about what happens when you don't own your work. Tupac signed a 3-page handwritten memo while sitting in a prison cell, desperate for freedom. He didn't have his own lawyer, he didn't fully understand what he was signing, and it cost him millions. Artists need to have their own legal representation. They need to read every contract carefully. They need to understand what they're signing before they sign it. And if a deal seems too good to be true, it probably is. Suge Knight was able to exploit his artists because the music industry allowed it. The contracts were designed to benefit labels, not artists. The accounting was opaque, the power dynamics were completely one-sided. And while things have improved somewhat in the streaming era, there's still a long way to go. Artists are still getting exploited. Labels are still taking advantage of young, inexperienced talent. We need more transparency in the industry. We need fairer contracts. We need better protections for artists. One of the reasons Suge got away with his behavior for so long was because people were too scared to speak up. Victims didn't go to the police. Artists didn't sue. Employees didn't blow the whistle. But silence only enables abusers. If we want to create a better industry, we have to be willing to call out bad behavior when we see it. Dr. Dre eventually spoke up and left. Snoop Dogg eventually spoke up and left, and their careers thrived after they got away from Suge. Speaking up is scary, especially when you're dealing with someone as dangerous as Suge Knight, but it's necessary. When you look at the whole picture, Suge Knight's legacy is one of wasted potential and unnecessary destruction. He had the opportunity to build something truly great. Death Row Records had the best talent in hip-hop. They had Dr. Dre, the greatest producer of all time. They had Snoop Dogg, one of the most charismatic and talented rappers ever. They had Tupac Shakur, a generational icon. If Suge had treated his artists fairly, if he had focused on the music instead of the violence, Death Row could have been the greatest label in hip-hop history. It could have lasted for decades. It could have launched the careers of countless artists. But instead, Suge chose greed and violence. He chose to exploit the people who trusted him. He chose to create an environment of fear instead of creativity. And in the end, he lost everything. Death Row collapsed. His artists left and went on to have successful careers without him. His reputation was destroyed, and he's now spending the rest of his life in prison. Meanwhile, the artists he exploited have gone on to achieve incredible things. Dr. Dre became a billionaire. Snoop Dogg became a global icon and now owns the Death Row catalog. Even Tupac, who died tragically young, left behind a legacy that continues to inspire millions. The lesson here is clear, gang. Talent wins in the long run. Creativity wins. Art wins. Violence and exploitation might give you short-term success, but they're not sustainable. Eventually, the truth comes out. Eventually, justice is served. Suge Knight finessed his artists out of millions of dollars. He used fear and violence to control everyone around him. He built an empire on the backs of talented people and gave them nothing in return. But in the end, he lost, and the artists he tried to destroy are the ones who are still standing. Look, I know this was a heavy video, fam. We covered a lot of dark stuff. Violence, exploitation, death, greed. It's not easy to talk about, but these stories need to be told. We can't let people like Suge Knight be remembered as legends or icons. We have to remember them for what they really were. Exploiters who took advantage of talented people and destroyed lives in the process. Hip-hop is about creativity, about expression, about giving a voice to people who don't have one. It's not about violence and intimidation. And if we want hip-hop to continue to grow and thrive, we have to hold people accountable. We have to demand better from our executives, our labels, and our industry. Suge Knight is in prison now and he'll likely die there. But his story serves as a warning. This is what happens when you choose violence over art, when you choose greed over fairness, when you choose fear over respect. Don't be like Suge Knight, gang. Be like Dr. Dre, who walked away and built something even greater. Be like Snoop Dogg, who escaped and thrived. Be like the artists who refused to let their creativity be controlled by fear. If you made it this far, drop a comment and let me know what you think. Do you think Suge Knight got what he deserved? Do you think the music industry has learned from Death Row's mistakes? Do you think artists today are better protected? Let's have a real conversation about this because these issues are still relevant today. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. Until next time, stay safe out there, gang. And remember, own your masters, read your contracts, and never let anyone control you through fear. Peace.